If you thought HOAs just argued about paint colors and trash bins, buckle up, because today's story makes those petty squabbles look like kindergarten recess. Picture this. A smug, power-drunk HOA Karen marching across the neighborhood like she owns the sidewalks, the trees, and apparently your newborn baby. Yes, you heard that right. This isn't satire. This isn't a meme. This is a real story about an HOA board member demanding that a Navy SEAL's wife hand over her infant. Why? Because community regulations apparently now extend to human beings. It's the kind of drama where your first reaction is laughter and then a double take when you realize someone actually thought this was a good idea. But the best part? Karen had no idea she was messing with a family protected by a man trained in covert operations, hand-to-hand combat, and the fine art of ending conflicts before they even begin. Today, we're diving into 10 jaw-dropping facts about this outrageous standoff, from the culture of HOA entitlement that breeds these bizarre power grabs, to the moment Karen made her fatal mistake, and finally, to the karmic fallout that left her reputation and her HOA in tatters. So how does an HOA board member even get the idea she can control someone else's baby? To answer that, we need to understand the monster factory known as HOA entitlement culture. Before we even get to the jaw-dropping moment when an HOA board member decided she could demand someone's baby like she was checking out produce at a grocery store, we need to zoom out and talk about the soil that grows these kinds of people, the culture of HOA entitlement. Because trust me, this sort of audacity doesn't just appear overnight. It's nurtured, fertilized, and given free rein until it blossoms into full-blown neighborhood tyranny. Let's start with the basics. Homeowners associations were created to protect property values. On paper, that sounds like a noble mission. Keep the grass trimmed, make sure no one paints their house bright purple with polka dots, and ensure the roads don't look like a demolition derby track. In other words, HOAs were supposed to be about order and consistency, a neighborhood's version of housekeeping. But somewhere along the line, the mission got hijacked. Instead of being humble caretakers, HOA boards slowly morphed into miniature governments run by volunteers with way too much time on their hands. And as any student of history will tell you, when you give power to people with fragile egos and no checks and balances, things spiral quickly. It's how you go from let's agree on mailbox styles to hand me your infant or face the wrath of community bylaws. This is where the idea of HOA God complex comes in. It's not an official psychological diagnosis yet, but maybe it should be. The symptoms are easy to spot. An inflated sense of authority, a belief that HOA bylaws outrank the U.S. Constitution, and an obsession with micromanaging the lives of everyone within walking distance. These people see themselves not as volunteers, but as sheriffs, mayors, judges, and occasionally, as in this case, self-appointed babysitters. Now, what's fascinating about entitlement is how incremental it is. Nobody starts off saying, I'll control your family. Instead, it begins small. First, it's a snippy note about leaving your trash cans out for an extra day. Then it's a fine for having a flower pot that's 2 inches taller than the regulation height. Soon, it's a full-blown screaming match about whether a child's sidewalk chalk counts as graffiti. And once they get away with those smaller victories, they begin testing just how far their authority can stretch. Karen, our main character in the saga, was the perfect storm of unchecked power and personal obsession. She wasn't content just policing lawn lengths or barking about Christmas decorations going up too early. Oh no, she wanted complete dominion. And in her mind, complete dominion meant being the guardian of all things community appropriate. You parked your car facing the wrong direction? To Karen, that wasn't just a parking mishap, that was an attack on harmony. Your kid left a tricycle in the driveway? In her eyes, that was disorder, chaos, and the first step toward neighborhood collapse. So when this Navy SEAL family moved in, young, disciplined, and minding their own business, they accidentally became her newest project. And here's the kicker. Karen didn't see herself as a villain. She thought she was the hero, the protector of order, the defender of neighborhood standards. To her, everyone else was sloppy, careless, and in desperate need of her iron-fisted guidance. Now, let's pause and think about this logically. What makes someone believe they can escalate from barking about weeds to demanding control over a newborn? It's because entitlement rewires how people view boundaries. Karen wasn't looking at this family as independent homeowners with their own rights. She was looking at them as subjects in her kingdom. And when subjects in your kingdom do things you don't like, you don't respect their autonomy, you intervene. It's outrageous, sure, but when you realize it came from a culture that rewarded her behavior at every step, it becomes less surprising. HOAs are designed to give petty personalities just enough legitimacy to feel untouchable, and Karen had soaked it up like sunshine on a Florida cul-de-sac. By the time we reached the infamous baby incident, this wasn't just a Karen being Karen moment. It was the natural conclusion of years of entitlement, ego, and a system that lets ordinary neighbors play emperor. But entitlement doesn't just simmer quietly in the background. Once Karen got the taste of control, her appetite only grew. And that's when her obsession began spiraling from petty complaints to full-blown invasions of privacy. If Fact 1 laid the foundation for how HOA entitlement grows like mold in a damp basement, then Fact 2 is where we start to see Karen's behavior move from mildly annoying to, "Are you kidding me?" Because once entitlement is fed, it doesn't shrink, it metastasizes. And for Karen, this meant expanding her dominion from paint colors and hedges into every nook and cranny of her neighbors' lives. Let's rewind a bit. When the Navy SEALs family first moved into the community, they weren't looking for drama. They wanted peace, privacy, and maybe the occasional block barbecue where nobody ended up in a shouting match about lawn ornaments. But peace and privacy were two things Karen couldn't tolerate. To her, new residents weren't neighbors. They were test subjects, ready to be poked, prodded, and disciplined until they fell in line with her vision for the community. Her obsession started small, as it often does. She left notes. Lots of notes. Passive-aggressive ones written in cursive with phrases like, "This is just a friendly reminder," which of course is HOA language for obey me or suffer. These notes pointed out tiny infractions, like a recycling bin left too close to the curb or a welcome mat that wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood. That's right, even doormats were subject to Karen's tyranny. But Karen wasn't content with paper notes. Soon, she graduated to surveillance. Not high-tech security cameras, mind you, just the old-fashioned binoculars and notepad routine. Neighbors began noticing her car parked at odd angles, watching their driveways like she was auditioning for a low-budget spy movie. Imagine trying to rock your newborn to sleep while Karen lurks nearby, scribbling in her HOA violation log. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. And because narcissism needs fuel, Karen fed hers by staging little public performances of authority. She'd show up at community meetings, wagging her finger and demanding stricter enforcement of rules nobody else cared about. She lobbied for bans on things like holiday inflatables, driveway basketball hoops, and, believe it or not, the sound of children playing too loudly. According to Karen, joy was a threat to order. But here's the dangerous part. When nobody stopped her, she took it as validation. Each time neighbors rolled their eyes or shrugged instead of fighting back, Karen interpreted it as consent. In her mind, silence equaled submission. And like any power-hungry figure, submission only emboldened her to push harder. This brings us to the Navy SEAL's wife, the unsuspecting target of Karen's escalating crusade. From day one, Karen zeroed in on her. Maybe it was because she was new. Maybe it was because she was quiet and didn't engage with the gossip network. Or maybe, and this is my favorite theory, Karen just couldn't stand the sight of someone living peacefully without acknowledging her authority. Whatever the reason, the wife became her fixation. The obsession took strange forms. She began commenting on how often the wife went for walks with the stroller, whether the baby blanket was community appropriate, and even how long the infant napped during the day. Yes, Karen had opinions on nap schedules because nothing screams neighborhood governance like micromanaging a baby's REM cycles. At this stage, most people would have recognized they were crossing a line. But for Karen, the line wasn't just crossed, it was erased.
Her need for control spiraled so far that she convinced herself she had a say in how the Navy SEALs family raised their child. And once that mental leap was made, it was only a matter of time before her entitlement manifested in the unthinkable, demanding the baby itself. It's absurd, it's chilling, and yet it's the inevitable product of unchecked obsession. Karen wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a self-declared warden, patrolling her prison yard and waiting for the next excuse to exercise her authority. And that excuse came in the most shocking form imaginable. The day Karen marched up to the Navy SEAL's wife and demanded custody of the newborn.
Up until now, Karen's behavior was irritating, creepy, and exhausting, but still within the realm of typical HOA nightmare. The passive-aggressive notes, the surveillance, the constant finger-wagging, these were all the greatest hits of your garden-variety, power-tripping board member. But then came the day. The day Karen decided to throw the HOA rulebook out the window and write her own script, one that nobody in their right mind could have imagined. It started like any other suburban morning. Birds chirping, lawns being watered, the faint hum of leaf blowers in the distance. The Navy SEAL's wife was out front with the baby, taking in some fresh air and probably savoring those rare moments of calm new parents live for. And that's when Karen appeared, marching across the cul-de-sac with the kind of determination usually reserved for police raids or marathon runners at the finish line. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, chin high. She looked like she was about to issue the most important citation of her career. What came next wasn't a request. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a demand. According to multiple witnesses, because you know a scene like this attracts an audience, Karen told the Navy SEAL's wife she needed to hand over the newborn. Her justification? The baby wasn't being properly cared for according to community standards. Yes, apparently, community standards now covered feeding schedules and stroller brands. Somewhere, George Orwell was rolling in his grave whispering, "I told you so." The wife was stunned. At first, she thought Karen was joking, some twisted attempt at humor that landed like a brick. But no, Karen doubled down, waving her clipboard like it was a badge and explaining how the HOA had the right to intervene when the well-being of the community is at stake. In Karen's mind, the well-being of the community and custody of a newborn were somehow connected. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Neighbors began to gather. Some were whispering, others were openly gawking. One reportedly muttered, "She's lost it," and another asked if they should call the police. But Karen wasn't embarrassed. On the contrary, she was energized, feeding off the attention like a villain in the final act of a superhero movie. The Navy SEAL's wife, caught between shock and outrage, stood her ground. She told Karen to back off firmly and clearly, reminding her that the baby was her child, not the HOA's property. But Karen wasn't ready to hear no. In her world, no was just another obstacle she could bulldoze with persistence. She began citing obscure HOA bylaws, none of which had anything to do with children, but that didn't matter. She twisted phrases about community harmony and safety regulations into a bizarre argument that handing over the infant was somehow justified. Let's pause here for a reality check. HOAs can issue fines for weeds, they can threaten liens for unpaid dues, and they can harass you over mailbox paint. But what they cannot do is seize human beings like they're repossessing a car. Karen wasn't just out of line, she was on a different planet. The crowd grew restless. Some tried to intervene diplomatically, urging Karen to walk away. Others pulled out phones, because if you think nobody was recording this circus, you've never met a neighborhood in 2024. Videos of the confrontation would later go viral, turning Karen into an overnight internet sensation, and not the good kind. Finally, the Navy SEAL's wife, channeling all the patience she could muster, made it clear that if Karen didn't step back immediately, the next person she'd be talking to would be the police. That was the moment Karen's facade cracked. She sputtered, ranted, and finally retreated, vowing that this wasn't over.
But it was, because what Karen didn't realize was that she hadn't just crossed a line, she had detonated it, and the fallout was about to arrive in the form of someone she never should have messed with, a Navy SEAL husband who doesn't take kindly to threats against his family. And trust me, when he found out, the entire HOA universe shifted because Karen wasn't just picking a fight with a mom, she had unknowingly declared war on a man trained to win battles most of us can't even imagine. If Karen thought demanding a baby from a sleek, deprived mother was bold, she clearly didn't factor in the wild card of this entire saga, the husband. And not just any husband, a Navy SEAL. That's right. A man trained to parachute into hostile territory, neutralize threats under pressure, and make life or death decisions faster than most of us can choose a Netflix show. Karen had officially picked the worst possible family for her power trip. When the Navy SEAL got home and his wife recounted the incident, his reaction wasn't explosive. It wasn't yelling, flipping tables, or storming down the street like a Marvel superhero. No. And that's what made it scarier. His reaction was calm, controlled, calculated. The kind of calm that says, I've been trained to dismantle chaos. And you, Karen, are about to learn what discipline looks like. Mabers later described his demeanor as chillingly professional. He didn't rant about the audacity of someone demanding his baby. He didn't sputter in disbelief. Instead, he gathered information. What exactly had Karen said? Were there witnesses? Did anyone record it? He built the situation in his mind the way he'd build a tactical operation. Fact by fact, piece by piece, until the entire battlefield was clear. And here's the thing about Navy SEALs. They're masters of escalation control. They don't just rush in guns blazing. They assess, they plan, and then, when the time is right, they strike with precision. Which is exactly how he handled this HOA meltdown. The very next day, he paid Karen a visit. Not aggressive, not threatening, but firm. He walked up to her door in broad daylight, calm as can be, and knocked. When Karen answered, still brimming with the misplaced confidence of someone who thinks HOA bylaws are the 10 Commandments, she got her first taste of reality. The SEAL explained, politely but unequivocally, that her behavior was unacceptable, that demanding custody of someone else's child was not only outrageous, but legally dangerous. He outlined the potential charges she could face: harassment, trespassing, even attempted kidnapping depending on how the law interpreted her actions. It was like being read her Miranda rights, but by a man who could probably disassemble and reassemble a rifle faster than she could find her HOA binder. Karen, of course, tried to backpedal. She claimed she'd been misunderstood, that she was only concerned for the baby's welfare. Classic Karen move. Rewrite history the moment the consequences arrive. But the Navy SEAL wasn't buying it. He leaned in, still calm, still collected, and told her, in no uncertain terms, that if she ever approached his wife or child again, the next conversation wouldn't be with him. It would be with the police, lawyers, and possibly a judge. The beauty of the moment was its precision. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to posture. His presence alone, his calm, trained authority, was enough to make Karen finally feel the weight of her own recklessness. Witnesses say she looked rattled, stammering through excuses while he stood there like a human embodiment of discipline. For the first time, Karen realized she wasn't in control. She wasn't the sheriff of the cul-de-sac. She wasn't the queen of the bylaws. She was a neighbor who had crossed into dangerous, legally indefensible territory, and she'd done it against the wrong family. The confrontation ended with the SEAL walking away. Mission accomplished. No yelling, no theatrics. Just a clear boundary drawn in concrete. And that's what made it unforgettable. Karen had been put in her place not by rage, but by pure, unshakable authority. But here's the kicker. Instead of learning her lesson, Karen doubled down. Because when you corner someone drunk on power, they often lash out harder, and her next move would drag the entire HOA into the mess.
At this point, a normal person would have taken the Navy SEAL's calm but firm warning as a cue to retreat, maybe bake an apology casserole, maybe resign quietly from the HOA board, maybe even move to a cabin in the woods and rethink life choices. But Karen? Oh no. Karen wasn't about to admit defeat. If anything, the confrontation only stoked her obsession. She'd been embarrassed, challenged, and stripped of her illusion of power. And for a Karen with an HOA title, that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Her next move? Escalation. And she didn't plan to do it alone. She rallied the HOA board. After all, she wasn't just some random neighbor with a clipboard anymore. She was Karen, the board member. And in her mind, that gave her the weight of an entire institution. So she marched into the next HOA meeting, armed with binders, highlighted bylaws, and a story spun so wildly, you'd think she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. According to Karen's version of events, she hadn't demanded a baby. No, no, no. She had been expressing concern for the welfare of a community child. She painted herself as a brave whistleblower, standing up for safety against negligent parents. The Navy SEAL's wife portrayed as unstable. The Navy SEAL himself framed as intimidating and aggressive. In Karen's retelling, she was the victim. The HOA board, predictably, was split. Some members were die-hard Karen loyalists, nodding along as if her fantasy was gospel. Others looked visibly uncomfortable, probably wondering how they'd ended up on a board where custody disputes were suddenly on the agenda. But here's the problem. With HOAs, they thrive on technicalities, and Karen knew how to exploit that. She dug through the bylaws like a lawyer prepping for trial, trying to find anything she could twist into a weapon. Rules about unsightly behavior? Maybe she could stretch that to include unfit parenting. Regulations on community safety? Surely that could be warped to justify her interference. She even floated the idea of issuing fines to the Navy SEALs family for hostile interactions with board members, a laughable attempt to penalize them for not handing over their child. But this is where reality came crashing down. You can only twist rules so far before they snap, and this time they snapped hard. First, legal experts pointed out the obvious. HOAs have no jurisdiction over parenting decisions. None. They can't regulate feeding times, nap schedules, or who holds a baby. They can't demand custody. They can't even threaten to fine someone for refusing. Karen's grand legal strategy collapsed under the weight of common sense. Second, the Navy SEAL family wasn't intimidated. Instead of cowering, they lawyered up. Their attorney fired back with a strongly worded letter that not only dismantled Karen's arguments, but also warned the HOA of potential liability for harassment and defamation. Suddenly, the board members who had been nodding along with Karen's rants weren't so eager to be co-defendants in a lawsuit. Funny how quickly loyalty fades when your wallet's on the line. And third, perhaps most humiliating of all, the community itself started pushing back. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes and ignored Karen's antics now spoke out. They showed up at meetings, signed petitions, and circulated videos of the baby demand incident that had already gone viral online. Public opinion wasn't just against Karen, it was a tidal wave of ridicule crashing down on her every move. The HOA, once her shield, was now a liability. Every attempt she made to weaponize it backfired, drawing more attention to her outrageous behavior. And while Karen may have thought she could hide behind the board, the truth was simple. She'd dragged the entire HOA into a fight they didn't want and couldn't win. But here's the thing about Karen. When one wall falls, she just looks for another to climb. And as her legal maneuvers unraveled, she found herself facing a new problem. The very community she thought she controlled was about to turn on her. If there is one thing Karen had always counted on, it was the silent compliance of her neighbors. People might roll their eyes, grumble under their breath, or whisper in private, but in public, most just went along with her antics to avoid the headache. That passive tolerance was the fuel that kept her reign alive. But after the baby incident, the dynamic shifted, big time. At first, the whispers spread quietly. A few neighbors compared notes, saying, "Did you hear what she tried to do?" One or two shrugged it off as classic Karen behavior, but the more details emerged, the harder it was to ignore. And once the video footage from the confrontation hit neighborhood group chats and eventually social media, the whispers turned into open outrage. Suddenly, Karen wasn't the enforcer of order, she was the clown at the center of a circus. Neighbors who'd once caved to her nitpicking now saw her for what she was, a liability. Nobody wanted to live in a neighborhood that could make headlines for attempted baby repossession. Nobody wanted their property value tied to a viral HOA scandal. And most importantly, nobody wanted Karen speaking for them anymore. The shift showed up at HOA meetings first, where Karen used to dominate with her binder of bylaws and army of sighs. She now faced an audience of angry homeowners. Instead of nodding along, people openly questioned her authority. They asked for receipts. They demanded accountability. One even quipped, "What's next, Karen? HOA approval for diaper brands?" The room erupted in laughter, at her expense. For a woman who thrived on control, nothing stung worse than ridicule. It didn't stop there. Informal neighborhood coalitions began forming. Families who had never really interacted started talking, uniting under a common cause, stopping Karen. Petitions circulated demanding her resignation from the board. Homeowners began filing complaints not against each other, but against Karen herself. She had become the problem the HOA needed to fix. And the social isolation hit just as hard. Where she once strutted around the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, Karen now walked streets filled with side eyes and cold shoulders. Neighbors stopped waving. Parents pulled their kids inside when she approached. Even her closest allies on the board began distancing themselves, sensing the fallout wasn't worth the association. Karen wasn't just disliked, she was toxic. The humiliation extended online. Clips of the baby demand confrontation spread beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from local news outlets and online forums that specialize in HOA horror stories. Comment sections roasted her with lines like, "Imagine thinking you can fine someone into parenthood," and "HOA, homeowners oppressing anyone." Overnight, Karen wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance, she was a meme.
If Karen thought things were bad when the neighborhood turned on her, she had no idea what was coming next. Because in the age of smartphones and social media, nothing stays local for long. And when your meltdown involves demanding someone's baby like it's a lost dog, you don't just end up in the neighborhood newsletter, you end up on the evening news. It all started with the video. Remember those neighbors who were filming the baby confrontation? Well, their footage didn't just sit in a group chat. It hit Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, where algorithms did what algorithms do best: amplify chaos. Within hours, hashtags like hashtag HOA baby snatcher and hashtag Karen versus Seal started trending. People couldn't believe what they were watching. Was it real? Was it satire? The answer, horrifyingly, was real. By the end of the week, local news outlets had picked it up. Anchors read the story with raised eyebrows, barely keeping straight faces, as they described how an HOA board member demanded custody of a Navy SEAL's newborn. The headline practically wrote itself: HOA Karen crosses the line, baby dispute goes viral. From there, the story snowballed. National outlets jumped in, turning Karen into the poster child of HOA overreach. Talk radio hosts roasted her. Late-night comedians slipped her into monologues. One joked, "Next week she'll be citing babies for crawling outside the designated walking zones." Even satire sites, like The Onion, couldn't compete with the absurdity of the truth. And the memes? Oh, the memes. They came fast and furious. Photoshopped images of Karen holding a clipboard in a maternity ward. Mock HOA violation notices addressed to baby, age 2 weeks. GIFs of Navy SEAL training exercises captioned, "When the HOA tries to take your kid." Karen had officially lost control of the narrative, and the internet had no mercy. The media frenzy also sparked deeper conversations. Legal analysts went on cable news to explain, in case anyone still wondered, that HOAs do not have the authority to seize children. Parenting blogs chimed in using the story as a cautionary tale about overzealous neighbors. Even real estate experts weighed in, warning that HOA scandals like this can tank property values faster than a foreclosure sign. For Karen, the fallout was brutal. She couldn't step outside without cameras in her face. Reporters showed up to HOA meetings. Strangers drove by the neighborhood just to snap photos of the infamous cul-de-sac. Her once prized position as neighborhood enforcer had been reduced to a punchline, and she had no one to blame but herself. Meanwhile, the Navy SEALs family handled it with the kind of calm grace you'd expect from people used to high-pressure situations. They didn't rant on TV or fuel the fire. They simply let the facts and the footage speak for themselves. That silence made Karen look even worse. Because while she sputtered excuses and claimed she'd been misunderstood, the viral video showed everything in crystal clarity. What made this moment so powerful was the scale. Karen had always thrived in a bubble where her word went unchallenged. But now, she wasn't just being challenged, she was being mocked on a national stage. And once you become a meme, there's no going back to anonymity. The HOA, too, found itself in the spotlight. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Karen. It was about every HOA across America. Commentators frame the story as proof of what happens when these boards get too much power. Homeowners from coast to coast shared their own HOA horror stories, each one feeding the fire. Karen had become the symbol of an entire system gone wrong. But if the internet was merciless, the legal system was even harsher. Because once lawyers, judges, and law enforcement got involved, Karen's delusions of power finally collided with cold, hard consequences.
Up until now, Karen's nightmare had mostly been social. The humiliation of going viral, the loss of her standing in the community, the memes that would outlive her HOA career. But all of that was just the warm-up. The real storm came when lawyers and law enforcement stepped in. Because while neighbors can roast you, the courts can ruin you. The first domino to fall was law enforcement. Multiple neighbors who witnessed the baby incident filed official complaints. Some had video footage, others gave sworn statements, and together the evidence painted a crystal clear picture. Karen hadn't just overstepped, she might have broken the law. Police didn't arrest her on the spot, but they did open a file. Words like harassment, intimidation, and even attempted custodial interference started getting tossed around. That alone would have been enough to rattle most people into silence, but not Karen. She doubled down, insisting she was within her rights as an HOA board member to intervene. Unfortunately for her, the law doesn't recognize HOA Karen as an official title. Prosecutors began reviewing whether her actions crossed into criminal territory, and suddenly the clipboards and bylaws she loved so much weren't shields, they were exhibits in a case against her. Then came the civil lawyers. The Navy SEALs family wasn't just going to shrug this off. Their attorney drafted a letter so sharp it could have cut glass. It accused Karen, and by extension the HOA, of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The demand? A full apology, financial damages, and Karen's immediate removal from the board. If the HOA refused, the family was prepared to sue. And given the public support on their side, it wasn't an idle threat. The HOA board panicked. Suddenly, Karen wasn't their crusader, she was their liability. Every dollar in the HOA's legal defense fund was at risk. If this turned into a lawsuit, homeowners' dues could skyrocket to cover costs. And if they lost, property values could tank. The very mission the HOA was supposed to protect, community stability, was being sabotaged by the actions of one rogue board member.
Insurance companies got involved next. The HOA carried liability coverage, but insurers don't like being dragged into scandals that look undefensible. They began circling the wagons, investigating whether Karen's behavior violated coverage clauses. Translation: if the lawsuits went forward, the HOA might be on the hook without a safety net. Meanwhile, legal analysts on TV had a field day. They explained how HOAs are powerful, but not omnipotent. They can fine you for weeds, yes. They can lien your house over unpaid dues, sure, but they cannot, under any circumstances, interfere with parental custody. What Karen attempted wasn't just beyond her authority, it was laughably illegal. Watching experts dismantle her arguments on national television was like watching someone shred a piece of paper with a chainsaw. The pressure mounted. Karen faced the possibility of personal lawsuits. The HOA faced the threat of bankruptcy-level legal costs. And the community, once her captive audience, was now openly demanding her resignation as the only way to protect themselves from the fallout. What's most ironic is that Karen thought the HOA shielded her. She believed that acting on behalf of the board gave her authority. Instead, it did the opposite. It dragged the entire HOA into the mud with her. For the first time, she wasn't just the neighborhood busybody. She was the legal weak point in an organization about to get hammered. But as devastating as the legal avalanche was, the long-term consequences were even more brutal because lawsuits end, headlines fade, but reputations, once they're ruined, they stay ruined. And Karen was about to learn just how permanent that damage could be.
If the legal avalanche buried Karen in paperwork, the reputational fallout buried her in something far worse: permanent humiliation. Because lawsuits can end in settlements, court cases eventually wrap up. But reputations? Once they're shattered, they're like a broken mirror. You can glue the pieces back together, but everyone will still see the cracks. In the neighborhood, Karen's name became synonymous with ridicule. Once, she strutted through cul-de-sacs with her clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge. Now, the only thing her neighbors saw when she passed by was a cautionary tale. Parents whispered to their kids, "That's the lady who tried to take someone's baby." Teenagers snickered when she walked to her mailbox. Former allies on the HOA board stopped returning her calls. Even the people who had once backed her crusades about lawn ornaments and recycling bins suddenly pretended they'd never supported her. The humiliation extended online, too. Her face had been plastered across news segments, her name tied forever to hashtags like #HOA baby snatcher. You could Google the neighborhood and instantly find think pieces, memes, and clips mocking her every word. Local comedians riffed on the story at open mic nights. Social media users photoshopped her holding a baby with giant HOA property of tags, and those images spread faster than the HOA could send violation letters. Karen wasn't just a local scandal anymore. She was immortalized as the poster child for HOA overreach. The fallout wasn't confined to Karen personally. The HOA itself became radioactive. Real estate agents quietly warned potential buyers, "This neighborhood? Oh, that's the one where the HOA tried to seize a Navy SEAL's baby." Property values took a dip. Home listings sat unsold for months. Families who once bragged about living in a well-maintained community now avoided mentioning the HOA altogether, fearing judgment or laughter. Board meetings, once Karen's stage, turned into hostile arenas. Residents brought up the incident at every opportunity. "How can we trust the board with landscaping budgets when one of you thought you could regulate custody?" The credibility of the entire HOA was shredded, and it didn't matter how many new bylaws they passed or fines they issued, nobody respected them anymore. For Karen personally, the isolation was crushing. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in her shadow. Community invitations dried up. Even casual interactions at the grocery store turned into awkward encounters, with people avoiding eye contact or whispering as she walked by. Once she was the enforcer, now she was the outcast. And for someone who thrived on power and attention, that exile was a punishment worse than any fine. Here's the kicker. Reputational ruin doesn't come with an expiration date. Even years later, the incident remained a punchline.
New residents who moved in after the scandal heard the story almost immediately, passed down like urban legend. Oh, you live here? Did you hear about the time an HOA board member tried to claim a Navy SEAL's newborn as community property? Karen could never outrun it, no matter how many explanations or excuses she tried to spin. The HOA, too, learned the hard way that reputational damage lingers. Insurance rates stayed high, lawyers kept sniffing around, and any attempt to rebrand the community was met with skepticism. You can plant flowers, repaint signs, even change the board's leadership, but when your neighborhood is a meme, it's nearly impossible to scrub that stain. The irony is delicious. Karen's entire identity had been wrapped around protecting property values and maintaining community standards. Yet her own actions tanked those very values and standards. She'd become the living embodiment of what HOAs claim to fight against: chaos, disorder, and devaluation. And as bad as the reputational fallout was, the story's ultimate legacy went even further. Because this wasn't just about one HOA, Karen, it became a national warning about what happens when petty authority goes unchecked.
By now, Karen had lost the neighborhood, lost her credibility, and lost any illusion of authority. But the real twist of this saga isn't just about her personal downfall. It's about the legacy she accidentally created, because her outrageous power grab turned into a case study of what happens when HOA authority spirals out of control. Across the country, people who'd never even lived under an HOA watched the viral videos and shook their heads. Parenting blogs, legal analysts, and talk shows all latched on to the same central theme. HOAs have too much unchecked power, and it's only a matter of time before another Karen somewhere else crosses the line again. Legislators even chimed in. In some states, lawmakers began re-examining HOA statutes, asking whether boards had too much latitude and not enough oversight. Panels were formed to explore questions like, should HOAs be able to harass residents into submission? Should they have clearer limits on what they can and can't regulate? Karen had unintentionally shined a spotlight on the darker corners of HOA culture, forcing uncomfortable but necessary conversations. But the cultural impact might be even bigger. For years, people shared HOA horror stories in hushed tones, swapping tales about petty fines or bizarre rule enforcement. Now, thanks to Karen, those stories had a mascot. She became the shorthand for everything wrong with neighborhood associations. Anytime a board tried to overreach, frustrated homeowners would roll their eyes and say, "Careful, we don't need another baby Karen situation." And let's not forget the Navy SEAL factor. The sheer absurdity of trying to intimidate a family whose patriarch is literally trained in warfare added an extra layer of mythos. This wasn't just an HOA power struggle. This was an epic David and Goliath tale where Goliath showed up with a clipboard and David happened to have military training. That detail turned the saga from bizarre drama into a story with staying power, the kind of legend neighbors will still be whispering about a decade from now. Even HOAs outside the scandal began to feel the ripple effects. Community boards scrambled to reassure residents they weren't that kind of HOA. Training sessions for new board members started emphasizing boundaries, with Karen's story cited as the what not to do example. In other words, she had become the ultimate cautionary tale. But here's the most important takeaway. This wasn't just about one bad actor. It was about a system that allows ordinary people, often with no training, to wield disproportionate control over their neighbors' lives. Karen's story forced homeowners to realize something crucial. You don't have to accept every HOA decision as gospel. You can fight back. You can organize. And if you happen to have a Navy SEAL on your side, you can win spectacularly. So while Karen's name will forever be tied to humiliation, the legacy she left behind is oddly useful. She exposed the cracks in a system too many people take for granted, and she reminded everyone watching that unchecked power, whether in politics, corporations, or HOAs, always finds a way to implode. And that's where we leave it. One HOA, one Karen,
one Navy SEAL, and one unforgettable reminder that the line between authority and absurdity is thinner than you think. So, there you have it. A suburban soap opera so absurd it sounds like satire, but every detail is true. A clipboard queen who thought HOA bylaws gave her custody rights, a Navy SEAL who dismantled her delusions without breaking a sweat, and a neighborhood that went from passive eye-rolling to open revolt, all captured in viral videos that turned one cul-de-sac into national news. The moral of the story: power trips don't end well. Whether it's an HOA board, a petty boss, or a neighbor with too much time on their hands, authority without boundaries always collapses under its own weight. Karen thought she was protecting the community. What she really did was torch her own reputation, tank her HOA's credibility, and give the internet enough meme material to last a lifetime. For the Navy SEALs family, it was vindication. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to fight dirty. They just needed to stand their ground and let Karen expose herself. And in the end, that calm, disciplined approach was more powerful than any rant could ever be. So here's my question to you. Was this the most outrageous HOA power trip of all time, or have you seen worse? Drop your stories in the comments, because if there's one thing we know, HOA wars are never truly over. And don't forget, hit that like button, subscribe to @HOA Wars, and share this saga with a friend who's ever gotten a nasty HOA letter. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't a lawsuit or a fine. It's a story so ridiculous, the whole world laughs.